In the annals of American history, there exists a proposal so sinister, so brazen, that it makes conspiracy theories look tame. A plan hatched in the corridors of the Pentagon, a plot signed by the nation's highest-ranking military officials, a scheme so audacious that it would require the assassination of Americans, the bombing of U.S. cities, and the destruction of commercial aircraft, filled with innocent passengers, all to ignite a war with Cuba. This is the true story of Operation Northwoods, the moment when power, ambition, and Cold War paranoia nearly tore the fabric of American democracy apart. To understand Operation Northwoods, we must first travel back to 1959, a year that would shake the geopolitical foundations of the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro, a charismatic revolutionary with a scraggly beard and an insatiable appetite for power, had just toppled the corrupt Batista regime in Cuba. What started as a revolution against tyranny quickly morphed into something far more ominous in the eyes of Washington. Castro began redistributing land, nationalizing American businesses, and most troubling of all, he opened Cuba's doors to Soviet influence. For the United States, still reeling from the Korean War and terrified of communist expansion across the globe, this was unacceptable. Cuba wasn't just another island 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It was a dagger pointed at America's heart, and the Pentagon was determined to pull it out. By 1961, the CIA had already hatched what they believed was the perfect plan, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Over 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles would land on the beaches of Cuba's Bay of Pigs and incite a popular uprising that would topple Castro once and for all. It was supposed to be airtight. It was supposed to be glorious. It was supposed to change history. What actually happened was catastrophic. The operation was underfunded, poorly coordinated, and rested on wildly optimistic assumptions about the Cuban people rising up against their leader. Instead, Castro's forces, equipped with Soviet MiG fighter jets, descended upon the invaders like a hammer against an anvil. Within 72 hours, it was over. Approximately 1,500 exiles were dead or captured. For the Kennedy administration, particularly for President John F. Kennedy, it was a humiliating defeat that would haunt the White House for the remainder of his presidency. But for the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Bay of Pigs wasn't a sign to abandon their Cuba obsession, it was a rallying cry. The military establishment believed they had been let down by civilian leadership. They believed Kennedy had gone soft on communism, and they were determined to finish what had been started. They would propose a plan so extraordinary, so reckless, that it would make the Bay of Pigs look like a Sunday school field trip. At the helm of this push was a man named General Lyman Lemnitzer. Born in 1899 in a small Pennsylvania town, Lemnitzer had spent over 4 decades in the U.S. Army, rising through the ranks as a decorated officer and strategist. He had served under presidents from Roosevelt to Eisenhower. He had planned military operations. He had earned respect and accolades. But by 1962, General Lemnitzer was a man with a singular obsession: invading Cuba. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in America, Lemnitzer wielded enormous power, and he was not a man who took disappointment lightly. After the Bay of Pigs debacle, Lemnitzer saw an opportunity to reclaim American prestige and, more importantly, to assert military dominance over the civilian government. He believed that if civilian leaders wouldn't authorize an invasion, then the military would create the justification that they simply couldn't refuse. This was the genesis of Operation Northwoods, a plan that would transform false flag terrorism, military deception, where attacks are staged to look like they came from an enemy, into a calculated instrument of government policy. Lemnitzer and his Joint Chiefs would essentially ask, what if we attacked our own country and blamed it on Cuba? What if we murdered Americans to justify a war? On March 13, 1962, General Lemnitzer sat at his desk in the Pentagon and signed a classified memorandum titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. This wasn't a fringe proposal scribbled by a rogue officer. This was a formally prepared, meticulously detailed plan that had been approved by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was then forwarded to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara for submission to the President. What followed in this document reads less like military strategy and more like the blueprint for domestic terrorism. The Pentagon had taken the art of false flag operations, a tactic used throughout military history, and weaponized it against the American people. The proposals ranged from the ambitious to the apocalyptic. Some seemed almost absurd. Others were genuinely terrifying in their specificity and calculated cruelty. Let's start with what the Pentagon called Operation Bingo, perhaps the most chilling of all the proposals. The military planned to take a civilian aircraft, secretly repaint it to match a real commercial airliner, and fill it with mannequins or actual passengers. The document was ambiguous on this horrifying detail. The fake aircraft would then be remotely piloted by military personnel over Cuban airspace. Here's where it gets darker. Once over Cuba, the remote-controlled aircraft would be remotely detonated. The explosion would destroy any wreckage, but not before radar signals were intercepted, showing the aircraft supposedly being shot down by Cuban MiG fighters. The Pentagon would then present evidence carefully fabricated, of course, that proved Cuba had attacked a civilian passenger plane. To make the story stick, the Pentagon proposed an extraordinarily grotesque touch. They would create a list of mock victims, complete names, addresses, and family backgrounds, and orchestrate staged funerals across America. Grieving families would be fabricated. Eulogies would be written for people who never existed. News coverage would plaster these false casualties across every television screen in the nation. The goal was to manufacture such overwhelming national outrage that the American people would demand military action, Congress would approve an invasion, and the Pentagon would finally get its war with Cuba. The beauty of the scheme, from a military perspective, was that it was nearly airtight. Who would question a tragedy? Who would demand evidence when emotions ran high? The Pentagon was betting that the American public was so traumatized by the thought of their own countrymen being murdered that they wouldn't ask questions, they'd just demand blood. But Operation Bingo wasn't the only scheme. The Pentagon had backup plans, multiple overlapping strategies, each more sinister than the last. Another proposal involved hijacking commercial airliners. The Pentagon suggested that CIA operatives could board scheduled flights, stage a fake hijacking by Cuban agents, force the pilots to fly low over Cuba, and then stage a shootout. Some aircraft would be shot down and destroyed. Others would land at military bases, where passengers would be quietly spirited away, either murdered to eliminate witnesses or kept in detention camps. The document even proposed a specific operational framework. Destination would be chosen only to cause the flight plan route to cross Cuba. The passengers could be a group of college students, off on a holiday, or any grouping of persons with a common interest to support chartering a non-scheduled flight. In other words, innocent college students heading to Miami for spring break could be loaded onto a plane that would be deliberately flown into Cuban airspace, where it would either be destroyed or the passengers would vanish forever, and America would blame Cuba. But why stop with hijackings? The Pentagon also proposed a series of bombing campaigns across American soil, Miami, Washington, D.C., even inside U.S. military installations, all targets for false flag bombings that would be blamed on Cuban agents. One memo specifically recommended a contrived Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The plan called for bombings of civilian targets with military precision, killing innocent Americans, destroying buildings, and spreading terror throughout the nation, all orchestrated by the Pentagon itself, all blamed on Fidel Castro. The Pentagon's audacity seemed boundless. Another proposal involved the USS Maine, a name that would have resonated deeply with every American history student. In 1898, the USS Maine had mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. The incident became the flashpoint for the Spanish-American War. "Remember the Maine" became the rallying cry for American intervention in Cuba. The Pentagon saw opportunity in historical echoes. They proposed staging an attack on an empty U.S. naval vessel, perhaps in Guantanamo Bay, and blame it on Cuba. The plan specifically mentioned sabotage ship in harbor, large fires, sink ship near harbor entrance, conduct funeral for mock victims. An empty ship would be destroyed, and America would mourn sailors who never died. But the Pentagon didn't just want to destroy ships and aircraft. They also proposed assassinations. The document coldly recommended the possible assassination of Cuban immigrants. Why? to create the appearance of Cuban agents committing violent crimes on American soil. American citizens, legal residents, who happened to be Cuban-born, would be executed by their own military and blamed on Castro. Even more disturbing was a proposal to sink boats carrying Cuban refugees on the high seas. Hundreds of desperate people fleeing communist tyranny would be deliberately drowned by the American military, and the crime would be attributed to Castro's Coast Guard. Their families would never know the truth. History would record it as a tragedy of communist brutality. The Pentagon was essentially proposing a campaign of mass murder, terrorism, and deception on a scale that would dwarf the Bay of Pigs. And they weren't vague about their intentions. The documents were specific, methodical, and chillingly bureaucratic in their presentation of organized atrocities. In February 1962, astronaut John Glenn became an American hero when he orbited the Earth in the Mercury Atlas 6 spacecraft. It was a triumphant moment for American technological prowess during the height of the space race. But for the Pentagon's plotters, Glenn's spaceflight represented something else entirely: an opportunity. One of Operation Northwoods' most astonishing proposals was this. If John Glenn's next spaceflight failed, if something went catastrophically wrong in orbit, the Pentagon would blame Cuba. According to the declassified documents, military officials actually considered sabotaging one of Glenn's flights, or, at minimum, fabricating evidence that Cuban agents had somehow interfered with American space operations. The proposal was audacious for a reason. Sabotaging a human spaceflight would almost certainly result in the death of the astronaut, but to the Pentagon, this was acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of their Cuba invasion. John Glenn's death, or the manufactured appearance of Cuban responsibility for it, could be leveraged to rally international support for war. Fortunately, Glenn's next mission never flew under Operation Northwoods' watch. But the very fact that the Pentagon was willing to sacrifice an American astronaut and the prestige of the space program illustrates just how far these men were willing to go. There were no red lines. There were no ethical boundaries. There was only the obsession with Cuba. But the Pentagon's planning extended beyond grand, spectacular attacks. They also proposed inciting domestic violence, stage-orchestrated riots among Cuban exile communities in Florida. CIA operatives would infiltrate these communities, agitate tensions, and provoke violent confrontations that would be blamed on Cuban agents supposedly infiltrating Miami. Imagine it. American citizens, fighting for their own freedoms, would be manipulated into violent riots by their own government, and the resulting bloodshed would be weaponized as propaganda against Cuba. Miami, a city with a significant Cuban population seeking refuge from Castro's tyranny, would become a battleground manufactured by American military intelligence. The Pentagon also proposed attacks on other nations. Jamaica and Trinidad-Tobago, both members of the British Commonwealth, were suggested as targets for covert false flag attacks. The rationale? If the United States secretly attacked these nations and then blamed Cuba, Great Britain would be forced to support American military intervention. The Pentagon was essentially proposing to attack innocent nations and drag the British into a war based on lies. Every proposal in Operation Northwoods followed the same blueprint: stage an incident, blame Cuba, manufacture outrage, and demand military intervention. It was terrorism wearing the uniform of the United States military. What makes Operation Northwoods genuinely alarming isn't just the individual proposals, it's the systematic, bureaucratic, and institutional nature of the planning. This wasn't a rogue general's fever dream. This was the product of the Department of Defense's formal planning process. This was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was presented to the Secretary of Defense for approval. The document itself reads like an instruction manual for state terrorism. It's written in the detached, methodical language of military planning. There's no moral anguish. There's no ethical hand-wringing. There's just the cold calculation of how to manipulate the American people into supporting a war through organized violence and systematic deception. One memo specifically states, a series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Translation: we will stage multiple terrorist attacks to create the appearance of a pattern of Cuban aggression. Another section outlines real or simulated actions against various U.S. Military and civilian targets. Translation: we will attack American military bases and civilian infrastructure, or we will fake the attacks so convincingly that people will believe they happened. The level of detail in these proposals is staggering. The Pentagon had thought through logistics, propaganda strategies, international response, media management, everything. This wasn't an off-the-cuff suggestion. This was a comprehensive military operation designed to unleash hell on American soil for geopolitical advantage. On March 13, 1962, Operation Northwoods was formally presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Within 3 days, on March 16, the proposal reached President Kennedy through his military advisors. This was the moment. This was when the President of the United States would learn that his nation's highest-ranking military officers had proposed a campaign of domestic terrorism. Kennedy's immediate reaction is recorded in a declassified memorandum. According to meeting notes, the President said bluntly that we were not discussing the use of military force, that General Lemnitzer might find the U.S. so engaged in Berlin or elsewhere that he couldn't use the contemplated 4 divisions in Cuba. In other words, Kennedy wasn't just rejecting Operation Northwoods, he was rejecting the entire premise that the military had any right to propose staging terrorist attacks on American soil. He told Lemnitzer essentially, "You're the military. You don't run foreign policy, and you certainly don't get to decide when we go to war by murdering our own citizens." It's a pivotal moment in American history, though most Americans have never heard of it. Had Kennedy been weaker? Had he been more politically vulnerable? Had he been less confident in his own authority as president, Operation Northwoods might have been executed, and America would have been transformed into a nation that deliberately murdered its own citizens to justify wars. But General Lemnitzer didn't take rejection well. After Kennedy's rebuff, the Pentagon didn't quietly shelve Operation Northwoods. Instead, they doubled down. They continued proposing false flag operations throughout 1963. A different Department of Defense policy paper from 1963 proposed new scenarios for manufacturing pretexts for military intervention. The relationship between Kennedy and his military leadership deteriorated rapidly. Tensions had already developed over the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy had resolved the standoff through diplomacy and careful negotiation rather than military confrontation. This infuriated the Pentagon brass, who saw it as weakness. Within months of Operation Northwoods being rejected, Kennedy made his decision. Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but this wasn't a dramatic firing in the media glare. It was a quiet, bureaucratic exile. Lemnitzer was transferred to Europe to serve as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a prestigious position on its surface, but a removal from power nonetheless. According to his aides, the general believed that Kennedy had gone soft on communism. He never accepted that the president had authority to reject military advice. He never acknowledged that civilian control of the military, a foundational principle of American democracy, meant something real. Lemnitzer saw himself as a warrior, protecting America from threats that civilians didn't have the strength to face. But Kennedy's removal of Lemnitzer sent a powerful message. The military doesn't get to overthrow civilian authority through an end run of staged terrorism. The president is the commander-in-chief, and the military serves at his pleasure, not the other way around. For decades, Operation Northwoods remained classified. The Pentagon had no interest in releasing documents that would reveal the Pentagon's willingness to wage war on its own civilians. Lemnitzer and others in the military establishment worked to ensure that evidence of Operation Northwoods was destroyed or buried. Many documents related to the plan were destroyed entirely. Why? Because if the American people knew that their military had proposed bombing American cities, assassinating American citizens, and manufacturing terrorist attacks on domestic soil, all to justify a war, it would fundamentally undermine faith in American institutions. It would suggest that the Pentagon viewed the Constitution as an obstacle rather than a sacred trust. For 40 years, the truth was hidden. While Lemnitzer retired with honors, while the Pentagon continued its covert operations around the world, while America fought wars in Vietnam and beyond, Operation Northwoods remained a closely held secret. Very few people outside the military even knew it existed. Everything changed on November 18, 1997. The John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, established by Congress to examine classified documents related to Kennedy's assassination, declassified approximately 1,521 pages of previously secret military records. Among them, Operation Northwoods. Suddenly, after more than 3.5 decades of official secrecy, the American people could read for themselves the actual proposals made by their military leadership. They could see the signatures of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They could study the methodical planning of domestic terrorism. The mainstream media, which had largely ignored the declassification initially, eventually began to report on the story. Journalists dug into the documents. Historians examined the implications. And slowly, the truth about Operation Northwoods seeped into public consciousness. What emerged was a stark picture of how close America had come to a military-industrial coup. What emerged was proof that even in the highest levels of government, there were officials willing to murder their own citizens to consolidate power. What emerged was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked military authority. Declassified documents reveal something crucial about Operation Northwoods. It wasn't a solo project. Yes, Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were the primary architects, but the plan had support in other quarters of the military establishment. Senior Pentagon officials like Paul Nitze, a legendary Cold War strategist, actually argued in favor of provoking a false flag incident with Cuba. Even more troubling, the Kennedy administration itself contained officials who were comfortable with the concept of false flag operations. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and the President's brother, had actually proposed a false flag attack on Guantanamo Bay as a justification for military intervention back in April 1961, just before the Bay of Pigs invasion. The difference was one of degree and timing. While Robert Kennedy had the same instinct toward false flag deception, his brother, the president, ultimately exercised restraint and authority. Kennedy understood that the Constitution required the president to control military policy, not the other way around. And when his military advisors proposed illegality and domestic terrorism, he said no. But the implications of Operation Northwoods extend far beyond the Cold War. The declassified documents reveal a crucial question that Americans must continue to ask. What prevents military officers from proposing or executing similar schemes today? What structural safeguards exist to ensure that future military leaders won't attempt an end run around civilian authority through manufactured crises and staged terrorism? Operation Northwoods shows us that the threat of military overreach isn't purely theoretical. It's something that actually happened, or nearly happened. It was proposed, documented, and only stopped by one president's willingness to assert civilian authority. Today, Operation Northwoods remains one of the most shocking revelations in modern American history. It's rarely discussed in schools. It's rarely mentioned in mainstream political discourse. But it should be, because it teaches us something vital about power, about institutions, and about the eternal vigilance required to maintain democratic governance. Operation Northwoods reminds us that the Constitution isn't self-executing. It's only as strong as the people and institutions willing to defend it. When Kennedy said no to Operation Northwoods, he was defending democracy. When he removed Lemnitzer from power, he was reasserting civilian control of the military. These weren't minor bureaucratic actions. They were the difference between America remaining a constitutional republic and becoming something far darker. The general who proposed the murder of his own citizens was exiled to a NATO command rather than court-martialed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff who signed off on domestic terrorism weren't purged or prosecuted. They were quietly dispersed to other assignments. In the end, Operation Northwoods survived its rejection, not as a cautionary tale, but as a classified secret buried deep in government archives, hidden from democratic scrutiny. But in 1997, the light was finally shined on that darkness, and it revealed something that Americans must never forget. The price of freedom isn't just eternal vigilance. It's the willingness to reject power, even when it's presented in uniform and wrapped in national security rhetoric. It's the strength to say no, even when saying no feels dangerous. Operation Northwoods never happened. The false flag attacks were never executed. The Cuban refugees were never drowned. The commercial aircraft were never destroyed. The American citizens were never assassinated. The war with Cuba was never fought based on manufactured pretexts. Because one president, on one day in March 1962, had the strength to say no. But the plan existed. The documents were real. The signatures were authentic. And it stands as a permanent reminder that democracy is fragile. That power, even when concentrated in high places, must be constrained. That military strength must always be subordinate to civilian authority. That the Constitution isn't just a piece of parchment, it's a shield against tyranny, held up by the courage of leaders willing to defend it. This is the story of Operation Northwoods, the Pentagon's darkest secret. The moment when America came closest to becoming a nation that murdered its own citizens to justify wars. The moment when democracy hung in the balance, and the moment when it was saved, not by military strength or geopolitical maneuvering, but by the simple, profound power of one man saying no to tyranny.